My name is Lillian, and I am 32 years old. My child's first birthday was supposed to be simple. A small gathering in our backyard, balloons tied to the fence, a homemade cake that leaned slightly to one side because I'm not a professional baker and never pretended to be. I didn't need perfection. I just wanted presents. For weeks, I'd told myself not to expect too much from my parents. That was a lesson I'd learned early in life. Hope, in my family, was something you rationed carefully or paid for later. Still, a part of me believed they would show up for this. Not for me, but for their grandchild. That felt like a reasonable expectation, even after everything. I sent the invitation anyway, short and polite, no emotional weight attached. I didn't call to remind them. I didn't plead. I just sent the date, the time, and a picture of the little banner we'd hung that read 1. It felt symbolic even then. 2 days before the party, my phone buzzed with a message from my mom. There was no greeting, no warmth, just a sentence that made my stomach drop. Honestly, we just don't need this. We don't recognize this grandson. I read it once, then again, waiting for the words to soften somehow if I stared long enough. They didn't. They sat there, blunt and unapologetic, like a verdict. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I felt something colder settle into place instead, something I recognized from childhood, the moment when you realize you're not going to be chosen, and it's pointless to ask why. I replied calmly, almost clinically. Okay, just don't come asking me for money for your debts, bills, and problems anymore. It was the first time in my life I'd said something like that to them without cushioning it with apologies or explanations. My father laughed when he read it. I know he laughed because he called me immediately, amused, dismissive, like I'd just made a joke that didn't quite land. He said I was being dramatic. He said I'd calm down. He said family doesn't work that way. He truly believed I would fold, because I always had before. What he didn't know was that my decision hadn't started with that text. It had started years ago, quietly, in moments I'd ignored until they stacked too high to carry. For most of my adult life, I'd been the one who kept my mouth shut and my wallet open. If my parents insulted me, I swallowed it. If they insulted my husband, I made excuses for them later, telling him they didn't mean it, that they were just set in their ways. If they needed money, for rent, for car repairs, for emergencies that never quite made sense, I sent it without asking questions. I told myself it was duty, loyalty, love. In reality, it was conditioning. My father's idea of parenting had always been humiliation disguised as discipline. He called it making me strong. My mother wasn't much different, just quieter, more passive, letting his words land while she looked away. When I married my husband, the contempt sharpened. He wasn't from the right family. He didn't have the education they respected. He worked with his hands, and that made him invisible to them. I spent years trying to smooth things over, dragging my husband to dinners I knew would end badly, watching him leave with his jaw tight and his eyes distant. He never asked me to choose, but I saw the question in his silence. Everything changed when our child was born. The first night in the hospital, holding that tiny, fragile life, I felt a clarity I'd never known before. This was someone I couldn't afford to fail, not the way my parents had failed me. Slowly, without announcing it, I began to shift. I stopped answering calls when I didn't want to talk. I stopped sending money every time they hinted they were struggling. I started putting my own family first, not as rebellion, but as responsibility. The birthday text was just the moment that made it impossible to keep pretending. 2 days after the party, I dropped an envelope into their mailbox. It wasn't thick, but it was heavy with meaning. Inside was a letter, not angry, not emotional, just clear. It listed every dollar I'd sent them over the years, every loan I'd forgiven, every quiet bailout I'd provided. At the bottom was a number that even surprised me when I finally added it up. $86,400. I didn't ask for it back. That wasn't the point. I wanted them to see the cost. What they didn't know yet was that weeks before the party, I'd already taken care of the legal side. I'd removed them from my emergency contacts, revoked the power of attorney they didn't even realize they still had, rewrote my will, and transferred our house into my husband's name alone. I changed the beneficiary on my life insurance policy. Every thread that tied me to them financially or legally, I cut cleanly. The envelope contained one last thing, a cease and desist notice from a lawyer, simple and formal. From that point on, they were not to contact me, my husband, or my child. Not directly, not through relatives, not at all. They weren't just missing a birthday, they were losing access. And they had no idea how much of their world depended on me. For a few days after I sent the letter, there was nothing. No angry calls, no dramatic messages relayed through relatives. Just a strange, unsettling quiet that made me wonder if they'd even read it yet. My husband noticed it too, the way I kept glancing at my phone without really expecting anything. He didn't push. He never does. He just stayed close, took over more with the baby, let me exist in that in-between space where you're waiting for something you know is coming but don't know how hard it's going to hit. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, my sister called. We'd never been particularly close growing up. She had always learned how to survive our family by becoming invisible, slipping in and out of conversations, staying just detached enough to avoid becoming a target. When I saw her name on my screen, I braced myself for anger or guilt or a lecture she didn't even believe in. What I got instead was exhaustion. She didn't ask why I'd done it. She said she'd gotten the same letter. That was the first surprise. I'd only sent one envelope to my parents, but apparently my decision had triggered something bigger than I realized. Once the money stopped coming from me, they'd turn to her, just like they always had, quietly and without shame. They'd been bleeding her dry, too. Car repairs she'd never driven. Credit card bills she hadn't run up. A loan she'd co-signed for that she'd never seen a dime of. Listening to her list it all out felt like looking into a distorted mirror of my own life. She sounded angry, but underneath it was relief. The kind that comes when you finally realize you're not crazy for feeling used. She told me she'd spoken to our mother the day before. Mom had been crying, saying she didn't understand why I was doing this, that I was overreacting, that I was punishing them over nothing. My sister said she hadn't argued. She'd just listened. Then she told me something I didn't expect at all. She said my letter had been a wake-up call, that she and her fiancé had decided to break up for good and that she was moving out of state in a month. She said she'd spent years watching our parents treat us like resources instead of daughters, and she didn't want that future anymore. Then she asked if she could come visit my child before she left. Not out of obligation, not because our parents expected it, but because she wanted to know her niece properly, without the noise and manipulation. When I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking, but not from fear. From the realization that something new was forming in the space where something old had finally collapsed. 2 weeks after the birthday, my father finally responded, not with an apology, not with a phone call, but with a short, bitter email. The subject line read, "What is all this?" No greeting, no punctuation, just 5 words from a man who'd built his entire life on pretending nothing could ever touch him. I read it once, then closed it. I didn't reply. That email wasn't about understanding, it was about control. He wanted me to explain myself, to justify why I'd finally stopped doing what I was told. Silence was the only response he didn't know how to fight. That's when the panic started to spread. Distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years began reaching out, all carrying the same message, dressed up in different tones. My uncle left a voicemail telling me I should make peace before things got worse. A cousin messaged my husband on social media, asking if he could talk some sense into me. They kept repeating the same line, like it was scripture. They're your parents. You only get one set. I ignored them all, not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood what they were doing, pulling on every string they had left, hoping one of them would still be attached. What crossed the line was when my mother contacted my husband directly. The message was long, venomous, and deeply revealing. She accused him of poisoning me against them, of turning me into a stranger. She said our child wasn't really part of the family and never would be. She called us selfish, ungrateful, and warned that if we wanted to play this game, we'd lose more than just family. The message ended with a sentence that sat heavy in my chest long after I closed it. We made her, and we can unmake her. That was the moment everything snapped into focus. This wasn't just hurt feelings or generational misunderstanding. This was entitlement, control, a belief that because they'd raised me, they owned me, my life, my child, and every dollar I'd ever earn. I forwarded the message to my lawyer and asked him to add it to the file. We began the process of filing for a formal restraining order, not because I wanted to escalate, but because I wanted protection. Boundaries only work if you're prepared to enforce them. Then I went after the things they'd always taken for granted. The electric bill was in my name. I canceled it. The gas bill followed. Their phone plan was part of a family package I'd been paying for since college. I canceled that too. The loan on my mother's old SUV was still partially under my name. I called the bank and reported unauthorized use. The car was repossessed within the week. Each step was methodical, documented, and legal. I wasn't acting out of anger. I was untangling myself. There was one last thing I'd never dealt with properly, something I'd buried years ago because it felt easier than confronting it. In 2019, my father had taken out a personal loan using my name. He said it was for a family emergency and promised he'd handle it. When I found out he'd signed my name without permission and missed payments, I'd paid it off myself to protect my credit. I kept the paperwork, though, every signature, every date, every lie. This time I didn't protect him. I filed an identity theft report with the lender and flagged the account for investigation. Within 48 hours, my parents' bank accounts were frozen while the fraud unit combed through every transaction tied to that loan. I found out through my sister, who texted me in all caps asking what I'd done and telling me they were losing their minds. I replied with one sentence. I finally stopped protecting them. That day, my husband and I took our child to the aquarium. We watched her press her hands against the glass, fascinated by the slow, drifting movement of the fish. We got ice cream. We laughed. For the first time in a long time, I felt like a mother instead of a daughter being pulled in two directions. My mother tried calling from a neighbor's phone that night. She left a voicemail crying, saying they were scared, cold, that they couldn't even buy food. I listened to it once and deleted it. I didn't feel guilt. I felt awake, like I'd stepped out of a fog that had followed me since childhood. When you spend your whole life being told you owe people for existing, freedom feels like betrayal at first. Then it starts to feel like oxygen. Once the accounts were frozen and the utilities shut off, the illusion my parents had spent decades maintaining began to crack in places I hadn't even known existed. I didn't need to announce anything. The consequences traveled faster than I ever could. People talk when comfort disappears, and my parents had built their entire lives on the assumption that someone else would always step in to cushion the fall. The first sign was the silence from my father. No emails, no angry demands, no performative confusion. He vanished the way men like him always do when they realize bluster won't work. My mother, on the other hand, unraveled loudly. She tried every channel she could find that didn't technically violate the cease and desist. Messages through cousins, notes sent with neighbors, a voicemail left with my sister begging her to fix this before things get out of hand. My sister didn't respond. She was already halfway out the door of a life she'd finally realized wasn't hers. A week later, the county property office called again. This time it wasn't about the illegal rental, it was about the mortgage. The bank's fraud investigation had triggered a broader review, and things weren't lining up. The 2 home improvement withdrawals I'd flagged earlier had been followed by several smaller transfers to accounts in my father's name that weren't disclosed on the original loan documents. That moved the situation from messy to serious. Still civil, still quiet, but serious enough that people started returning calls they'd ignored before. I found out what was happening the same way I'd learned everything else in this family, through the grapevine. A cousin texted asking if it was true my parents were under investigation. Another asked if I'd gone too far. I didn't answer. I didn't owe anyone an explanation anymore. The truth didn't need defending. It was doing just fine on its own. Meanwhile, Daniel's situation deteriorated quickly. Without access to my parents' accounts, he couldn't hide behind their excuses anymore. The payday loan collectors found him at my parents' place, the same address he'd used for the rental listing. That was when things turned ugly. There was shouting in the driveway, a police visit, neighbors watching from behind curtains. My mother tried to frame it as harassment. The officer disagreed. From what I later heard, Daniel left that night with a duffel bag and nowhere to go. That was when my parents finally understood what I'd meant when I said I was done funding their problems. Not metaphorically, literally. They attempted to sell the house quietly, hoping to downsize before the bank could move further. The listing went up without photos at first. a rushed job full of vague language about motivated sellers. I recognized the tactic immediately. They weren't trying to maximize value, they were trying to escape. What they didn't know was that the moment the property hit the market, it set off another chain reaction. The Homeowners Association requested a full compliance review before approving any sale. That meant inspections, paperwork, questions. The illegal basement rental resurfaced, along with the missing permits for the so-called renovations. Fines were issued. The buyer backed out. Another offer came in and fell apart just as quickly. Each time, the reason was different, but the outcome was the same. No sale, no exit. I heard about it from my aunt, who called pretending to check on me. She told me my parents were stressed, that they felt betrayed, that they didn't know how things had spiraled so fast. I listened quietly and then told her something I'd never said out loud before. I told her they hadn't spiraled. They'd been standing on the edge for years. I'd just stopped holding them up. The call ended shortly after that. By early autumn, my parents were forced into a rental they could barely afford. My mother took a cashier job at a discount store. My father started doing odd jobs around the neighborhood, work he once would have scoffed at. The people they used to impress now nodded politely and moved on. No more dinner invitations. No more church committees. No more borrowed money disguised as generosity. Their social circle shrank to necessity. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was distance, a widening space between who I used to be and who I was becoming. For the first time, their chaos didn't reach me. It didn't dictate my mood or my schedule or my sleep. I could breathe. Then, just when I thought the worst of it was over, something surfaced that changed the entire story. It started with an email from a distant cousin I barely remembered. She wrote cautiously, almost apologetically, asking if I knew anything about our grandmother's estate. At first, I thought she had the wrong person. My grandmother had died when I was in college, and I'd assumed everything had gone to my parents. That was what we'd been told. There hadn't been any drama, no disputes, no questions. But according to my cousin, that wasn't the full truth. She attached copies of old emails and bank statements she'd uncovered while cleaning out her mother's files. There was mention of a safety deposit box, a handwritten note, jewelry, bonds, a coin collection. Assets that were supposed to be divided among the children. Assets that, according to my parents, didn't exist. My chest tightened as I scrolled. The dates lined up, the withdrawals, the timing of my grandmother's death, and the sudden improvement in my parents' finances shortly afterward. It wasn't proof yet, not legally, but it was enough to raise a question no one had dared ask before. Had they taken more than just my money? I didn't respond to my cousin right away. I forwarded everything to my lawyer instead. He called me an hour later, his tone careful. He said if this information was accurate, it opened the door to something much larger. Not just family conflict, potential elder financial abuse. That night, after I put my child to bed, I sat in the dark living room and felt the weight of it all settle in. I'd thought this story was about boundaries, about self-respect, about finally saying no. I hadn't realized it might also be about exposing a pattern that stretched back generations. And once a pattern is visible, it doesn't stay quiet for long. Once the possibility of elder financial abuse entered the conversation, everything shifted from personal to irreversible. I hadn't gone looking for this. I didn't dig through old boxes or interrogate relatives. The truth had surfaced because someone else finally asked the question I'd never been allowed to ask growing up. Where did the money actually go? My lawyer warned me that once we moved forward, there would be no clean way back. Investigations don't pause for family sentiment. I told him to proceed anyway. The first formal inquiry went out quietly. Just requests for documentation, just questions phrased in neutral language. That was all it took. People panic when paperwork is involved, especially when they've built their lives on the assumption that no one will ever look too closely. My parents responded the way they always had, with outrage and denial. According to my sister, my father insisted this was all my fault, that I was stirring up old ghosts out of spite. My mother claimed my grandmother had wanted everything handled privately, that the rest of the family was greedy for questioning it now. None of that mattered. What mattered was that records existed, and they didn't match the story we'd been told for years. As word spread through the extended family, more people began reaching out, not to accuse me, but to compare notes. An aunt admitted she'd always wondered how my parents managed to pay off certain debts so quickly after my grandmother died. A cousin mentioned a loan that was promised and never delivered. Another relative said my grandmother had once mentioned a ring she wanted passed down, a ring no one had seen since the week of her funeral. Each message felt like another piece snapping into place, not with drama, but with sickening clarity. The investigation didn't explode publicly. It crept. Bank requests, estate records pulled, old safety deposit box logs resurfaced. My parents stopped answering their phones altogether. According to my sister, they were convinced this would all blow over if they just stayed quiet long enough. That strategy had worked for them before. It didn't work this time. By late fall, the pressure reached a breaking point. The bank finalized its fraud review and formally restricted my parents' accounts pending further action. The county issued notices regarding the unlicensed rental and outstanding fines. The estate inquiry escalated from questions to formal claims. Nothing had gone to court yet, but the writing was on the wall. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one holding them up. I found out through a neighbor that my parents were having a garage sale, not the casual kind people have for spring cleaning. This was desperate. Tools my father had treasured, jewelry my mother wore to church every Sunday, furniture they'd once bragged about buying new. It was all laid out on folding tables, priced to move. People they used to impress now rifled through their things without ceremony. I didn't go see it. I didn't need to. The image was enough. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt. There was no triumph in watching them lose control, just a quiet, steady sense that this was always where things were headed. You can only take for so long before something gives. I'd just been the first to stop absorbing the impact. Then, in the middle of all that, I received a letter I never expected. It arrived without a return address, handwritten in careful, unfamiliar script. I almost threw it away, assuming it was another attempt to guilt me through some indirect channel. But when I opened it, my hand started to shake. It was from my grandfather. My father's father. The man I thought had been dead since I was a teenager. He wasn't dead, he'd left. The letter was short and direct. He said he'd heard through someone in town that I'd broken the chain. Those were his words. He wrote that he'd walked away when my father was already an adult, not because he wanted to, but because he didn't know how to undo the damage he'd already caused. He'd watched his son become the kind of man he used to be and didn't know how to fix it. So he disappeared. He said he never reached out because he didn't think he deserved to. But hearing what I'd done meant something to him. It meant someone had finally stopped the cycle. He ended the letter with a sentence I read over and over. If you ever want to talk, I'd like to meet the woman who did what I couldn't. I sat at the kitchen table long after reading it, the house quiet around me, my child asleep down the hall. I showed the letter to my husband, expecting anger or disbelief. He just read it slowly and said, "It's up to you now, not them." He meant my parents, the ghosts of who they were, all of it. I didn't know if I would respond. I still don't. But the letter cracked something open in me that had been sealed for years. It made me see how deep these patterns ran, how long they'd been passed down, like inheritance no one questioned. But it also made something else clear. I had already changed the ending. After that letter, everything slowed. Not because the chaos around my parents stopped, but because it no longer felt like it belonged to me. The investigations continued in their own lanes. Lawyers exchanged documents, relatives took sides, and my parents faded further into the background of their own making. I didn't track the details anymore. I didn't ask for updates. I let the process unfold without my supervision for the first time in my life. At home, life was quieter in a way that felt unfamiliar at first. My child learned to walk, then to run, then to laugh at things that made no sense to anyone but her. My husband's patience, something I'd always admired, felt deeper now, steadier. We fell into routines that didn't involve bracing for the next crisis or preparing for the next request. No more late-night calls asking for help. No more calculating whether saying no would cost me love. There was just space. My sister moved out of state as planned. I helped her pack, the two of us working in comfortable silence until she finally said something that caught me off guard. She said our parents seemed smaller now, less intimidating, less powerful. I knew exactly what she meant. They'd only ever been large because we were trained to stand beneath them. Once we stepped aside, they were just people, flawed and afraid and exposed. I never responded to my parents again. Not to the last angry voicemail, not to the message passed through a cousin saying they wanted to talk things out. Talking had never been the problem. Control was, and I wasn't handing that back. Months later, on the anniversary of my child's first birthday, we celebrated quietly. Just the three of us. Cake smeared everywhere, laughter echoing through the backyard. There were no empty chairs, no expectations, no performances. It was perfect in its simplicity. I thought about that original text sometimes, the one where my mother said they didn't recognize my child. I realized she was wrong in a way she'd never understand. Recognition isn't something you declare. It's something you earn by showing up, by protecting, by choosing someone even when it costs you. They hadn't recognized us because they never planned to. I still don't know if I'll answer my grandfather's letter. Maybe one day I will, maybe I won't, but I don't feel pressured either way. For the first time, my choices belong entirely to me. Breaking a cycle doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like silence, like walking away, like refusing to explain yourself to people who never listened in the first place. My parents lost more than access to my money. They lost access to my life. And what I gained in return was something I didn't even know I was missing. Peace.